Welcome to Microdose Psychedelic Insights, powered by the Conscious Fund. This is the Psychedelic Insider Series, fireside chats with industry leaders in the psychedelic space.
Ian, welcome to Psychedelic Insiders. Thanks for taking the time on a Wednesday evening to sit down and chat about Bright Minds Biosciences and what y'all are up to. I'm excited to sort of dig in and hear more.
Great. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on here, guys. Paul, I've definitely read a lot of your work, so it's nice to finally meet you in the COVID way, but nonetheless, great to meet you.
Absolutely. It's great to meet you as well. And I first heard about your work maybe a few months ago. It's sometimes hard to keep track of all the new companies that are coming into the psychedelic space, especially over the past 6 to 9 to 12 months. So I'd love if just for myself and for the people who are going to listen to this either live or after the fact, I'd love to just start with your story and coming into psychedelics. So even before you started Bright Minds Biosciences, what was your path getting into psychedelic medicine? What was your own journey with these medicines? And let's just start there, and then we can sort of see what unfolds from.
Yeah, sure. So long time user and long time lover of psilocybin mushrooms. I'd say that started out, call it around high school, growing up in Vancouver, going foraging for mushrooms every now and then. Then kind of, I'd say around 2015, I can't remember the exact event, but I stumbled upon some article or something that illuminated the fact that these are powerful antidepressants and useful in a range of neuropsychiatric disorders. And then from that point, I sort of went down the rabbit hole of reading every single research paper I can get my hands on and trying to understand what these compounds, the potential of these compounds, where some of the problem sets existed, and how I could potentially contribute to advancing the science. And with that, started reaching out to the authors of all those papers and putting everything together, decided on creating a biotechnology company focused on creating next generation psychedelic drugs. So in 2017, we sold our last company, and that gave me the time and capital to really start this and take it on full bore. So from that point, I put together a team of who I believe are the top medicinal chemists in their field, clinicians, advisors, and really put together a group that was focused on the goal of advancing psychedelic science in a targeted approach. A lot of the first generation psychedelics are wonderful. I'm a huge fan of them. But our view was to give practitioners another tool in their toolbox to use.
And so when it comes to Bright Minds Biosciences, what do you consider as first generation psychedelics, and what would you be looking to develop that sort of second generation psychedelics, if you will?
I would say any first generation psychedelic would be like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, MDMA, drugs that hit a broad set of receptor sites. And with second generation, what we're trying to do is create more targeted therapies and tailor drugs for specific indications.
So would 2CI or 2CB, are those considered second generation, or? I mean,
2CB, 2CI, 2CX series are all derivatives of mescaline, right? That's the chemical backbone that they're starting off of.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, when you call it a first generation, when you call it a second generation, it's sort of, I guess, hard to pin down, or somewhat pointless to pin down. And speaking of that chemical compound class, I think that's certainly one of the most interesting groups out there, and one that's been understudied.
So what was then your background before getting into Bright Minds Biosciences? So you had mentioned you had sold a company, and then
Yeah,
like
so
with that you had started that. So yeah,
yeah,
tell us a little bit about that.
I was a finance professional before this. So started my career off in merchant banking, where we would effectively incubate companies, foster them, grow them, and then take them to an exit point, whether that be public markets or private sale. And that was for a wide range of industries. And from then I went on to a career in investment banking. That was primarily focused on mining, but advised companies in different industries as well. Yeah, that's really the side of the business that that my expertise lies in.
Okay, so you have a finance background. You're starting you started Bright Minds Biosciences. What are the specific things that you're, especially with the next, with what you're raising funds for, and this first round of things, what indications are you focused on in terms of exploring with research and diving deeper into?
Yeah, good question. So we have our compounds today. We have a portfolio of compounds. Some of them have very promising data for indications, neuropsychiatric indications, ranging from the typical indications you hear of for psychedelics like MDD, PTSD, etc. But also we have quite promising preliminary data for animal data for in schizophrenia models, for some of our 2C compounds. Some of our other compounds have quite compelling data for what I would classify as impulse control disorders, such as OCD, but also other things like binge eating, which is another impulse control disorder. And then a separate bucket are pain indications. So cluster headache is a well-known one, but also fibromyalgia is an interesting indication, which psychedelics and our compound specifically have promise for, as well as several other pain disorders. We've actually just entered into a partnership with the National Institute of Health to classify our compounds and do a lot of test work on them for pain indications. And the NIH's interest in psychedelics and non-opioid pain medications in general is to stem the addiction problem that's been going on in the United States, that I'm sure everyone listening to this is well aware of. Opioid use in the States and everywhere generally starts from prescription pain medication that morphs itself into a heroin addiction, or could just be a prescription pain medication. And the issue there is there are no real good pain alternatives to opioids. Opioids are very effective at treating pain disorders, but obviously come with significant side effects, both from an addiction standpoint and a mental health standpoint. So what Congress has done is put together a large fund. I don't recall what the exact amount is, but it's around $1 billion as part of their HEAL initiative. And what that is focused on is creating these, funding basic science into developing non-opioid pain medications. So our compounds fit quite well into that, and we're looking forward to seeing the preliminary data out of that.
And those are psychedelic compounds that are helpful for
Correct.
pain, like anti-inflammatory. Like they specifically target.
Yeah. So the mechanism of action for psychedelics, anti-inflammatory is a very interesting space, which we're not necessarily so focused on, but I think groups like Eleusis are doing tremendous work there. But for a lot of these pain indications, there's sort of a mental aspect to it. A lot of pain is not just there's a perception element to it as well, which we're trying to target with our medications.
Can you say more about that? Like, what role would psychedelics play in recreating that perception? Does it have something to do with psychosomatic experiencing, or does it have something to do with the placebo effect? Do you understand sort of some of the mechanisms of action that are going on behind that, or is that still to be determined by research and what you're getting out there?
I would say still to be determined by research. Our belief is that these drugs work for a broad indication of what we would consider to be circuit disorders.
Mm-hmm.
Most are based off of that core premise, and that's certainly true for things like phantom neuropic pain. That's certainly purely a mental issue. It's for those listening who don't know, it's basically when you have lost a limb, and your mind is still telling you that there's pain coming from that lost limb.
Yeah, that's a pretty crazy thing, and it's very obviously this happens to very, very few people, and it's still a huge issue that we haven't been able to understand and resolve whatsoever. So I think it's fascinating that you all are working on that. So towards the beginning of the conversation, we talked a little bit about Bright Minds Biosciences, how you're developing second generation, psychedelic substances to address a number of the indications that we already spoke about. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about, like, what does your team consist of so far? So is it you and a co-founder? Are you mostly researchers and scientists, or so what's the nucleus of the team? And then, from that, what are your sort of day-to-day responsibilities right now as the company leader? Are you mainly focused on, fundraising? Are you mainly focused on clinical trials? Where are you spending a lot of your time and energy?
To address the first point, our team is primarily, pretty much all scientists and medical professionals. So I have two scientific co-founders. One is Gideon Shapiro. Gideon is a medicinal chemist. He started off his educational career at Berkeley, and then went over to Switzerland, studied at ETH. From there, he actually went to Sandoz and was working, believe it or not, one floor below where Albert Hofmann worked in the CNS division. So over time, he actually went on to run that entire ergot collection, and did quite a lot of work with psychedelics there. His last 7 years have been spent in a related field, the NMDA field, or ketamine, creating a second generation ketamine drug there, and that was a venture with Fidelity Biosciences and Allergan. So he is one of our leading minds on the scientific side. The other scientific co-founder is a gentleman by the name of Alan Kozakowski. Alan, after going to school at Berkeley as well, went the academic route and worked for a number of universities: George Washington University, Mayo Clinic, University of Chicago, Illinois. And while at University of Chicago, Illinois, he had a partnership with Brian Roth, who is a famed neuropharmacologist. They had a program where they spent 4 years and several $1 million creating targeted psychedelics, basically second generation psychedelics, which Bright Minds has now licensed from the University of Chicago, Illinois. So those are the two scientific co-founders. Beyond that, we have our chief medical officer, Ravati, who is a physician with 20 years of experience on the field and has been working in biotech for a large portion of her career. She really helps in helping out with the clinical aspect and clinical development portion of Bright Minds. Beyond that, we have a team of chemists that are working around the clock to create new psychedelics. So we have several chemists working at the moment, as well as a couple groups we're working with to test those compounds. So the first point of triage is in vitro testing, which is basically in testing the compounds in a test tube to see if they hit the specific receptor sites that we're targeting. Once it goes through that battery, we then go on to animal models, which are being done at a separate facility. And once we can prove that these drugs are effective and safe, then we go on to clinical trials. Outside of that, we have a number of advisors in terms of computational chemistry, which is basically using computer modeling to determine the structure of the compound and how that fits into the sort of like a lock and key model, how that fits into the receptor site in the body before we actually make the molecule. So that allows us to get a little higher degree of precision and whittle down from call it hundreds of compounds down to, say, the most 10 or 20 of the most interesting, the ones that we think that will work the best. That gentleman is working out of Italy, Guido Visoli. We're also working with a couple of advisors on the clinical side. One of them is Peter Hendricks at University of Alabama at Birmingham. Peter is running a trial for cocaine addiction there, and that's mostly focused on impoverished communities and pretty deeply addicted crack cocaine users for psilocybin. And that trial is seeing quite impressive results in its early phases. Also, he's doing a trial for fibromyalgia, which we plan on using our compounds once they're ready for this, as well as an advisor for cluster headaches. So we're working with a lead doctor at the Mayo Clinic who is specialized in cluster headache and using his expertise to drive the clinical development of our cluster headache drug.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the cluster headache? Because I know that that's sort of the main feature on your on the website, and obviously, yeah, cluster headaches are a very, very specific indication. So I'd love if you could just talk a little bit about why you chose cluster headaches, what has been found to be effective or not effective for cluster headaches, and why you think psychedelics, will be great for that.
Yeah, sure. So the typical first line treatment for people with cluster headache is something called sumatriptan. Sumatriptan is a shot you can take which aborts your headache, but it doesn't prevent your headache. So if you have cluster headaches, you typically experience them in the springtime. You typically experience them episodically in the springtime. So you have roughly, call it 3 headaches a day. The average person has roughly 3 headaches a day, which lasts on average from 15 minutes to 90 minutes. I would say 45 minutes is the most common. And you have those headaches 3 times a day, and they're excruciating headaches. It's the most painful sensation that has been characterized in man. So with sumatriptan, the limitations are that you can only take it so many times per week. Or else it leads to some negative effects from a cardiovascular perspective. So typically that's limited to roughly 3 times per week. So if you're a cluster headache sufferer, you have to pick 3 headaches of your 21 headaches per week, which is not ideal. The other therapies that are available are high flow oxygen, which again works as an abortive. There are a couple more invasive treatment options. One is called a vagus nerve stimulator, which is an electrical device which you basically implant into your brain, and you hold up what looks like a cell phone, which triggers it, and then that sends an electrical current to your vagus nerve, which a lot of patients have been seeing positive effects from. The one drug, or the one class of drugs that's really worked for patients suffering from cluster headache are serotonin 2A antagonists or psychedelics. LSD has been proven to be quite effective. Psilocybin has certainly been proven to be quite effective. Bromolysergic acid has been proven to be quite effective. 5-MeO-DMT. And these drugs work in in a slightly different way. So instead of aborting the treatment, what they do is typically after a dose of psychedelics, your cluster headache will go into remission for a period of time. And that period of remission will depend on dose and will depend on the individual patient. But let's say, for sake of conversation, a medium dose of psilocybin will put your cluster headache in remission for a period of a month. And that's something that hasn't been accomplished with any drug on the market. So there's a very strong citizen science angle for psychedelics to treat cluster headache, but it hasn't undergone much by way of clinical trials. So there's a phase 1 clinical trial going on with a small patient population at Yale right now by a researcher by the name of Emanuel Schindler, who is doing a great service to the cluster headache community. But in order to get that drug approved, it's going to need to have phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, which get quite expensive. So that's an area we're excited to step into and hopefully help out that community by getting an approved drug to market, and one that can be prescribed by a doctor and one that can be reimbursed by healthcare providers.
Yeah, I mean, cluster headaches are known as, I think, some of the most painful things ever. So, there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence about the efficacy of microdosing. People who have had cluster headaches will consistently microdose, and that will help, or they'll do a high dose trip every now and then, and that's been shown to help as well.
Microdosing certainly works for this too. So, very, very, very promising indication for microdosing. So the patient group, I guess the most known patient group that's been having success with this is one called Cluster Busters. And it was started by a guy named Bob Wald. And Bob Wald has more or less dedicated his life to making sure that cluster headache sufferers know that there are alternatives out there, and trying to advance this in terms of getting it to be an approved therapy. So, it's a tremendous, I think it's a tremendous lead indication. It's one with a high unmet medical need from a commercial standpoint. And we believe that we can get breakthrough therapy designation by going after a cluster headache that will reduce the FDA approval process by, on average, roughly 30%. It's an indication that needs to be approved. It's an indication we know works. I think it's really low-hanging fruit that should be addressed.
Beautiful, yeah, and it definitely needs to be. So I had pulled up the Vice article that was written about Bright Minds, and in it talks a little bit about this concept of sort of a bad trip-proof psychedelic. And so I'd love just to hear you talk a little bit more about these, designer drugs that you're developing, the second generation psychedelics. How are you designing them in such a way to minimize the potential of having a negative experience? Like what are some of the specifics that are going on molecularly, or whatever you're doing to sort of see how that could be facilitated?
Yeah, I'm not so sure that can be done. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that was somewhat miscategorized in that article. I don't expect our drugs to be any different than LSD, any different than DMT, any different than psilocybin in that regard. They're working on the same mechanisms, and I mean, they're still going to be subject to set and setting like every other psychedelic.
Very cool. So what's your day-to-day like? Like at this point in time, what are you focused on? What do you do every day when you're showing up to the office?
So I'm blessed with having a team of scientists who have that side down pat. They've done it before. They just came out of the core of our team just came out of another company called Regen Therapeutics, which is basically doing the exact same thing for ketamine. So it's more or less a rinse and repeat from that angle. From my side, it's a lot of boring work. going through today. I was going through an NIH approval process for writing a grant and submitting that. A lot of work on bringing in new investors to make sure that we have the financial resources to drive forward at the pace we like. Liaising with regulators and that sort of thing. So nothing too glamorous from my side, that's for sure.
Super technical right now, which is necessary because you got to put those pieces in place to ensure that you continue to grow and develop and all that. So let's say, like, how does the team continue to grow and develop? Like, are you pretty much set and solid with the team that you have now? Will it grow as you bring in more investment, or will that investment go towards, the clinical trials and all the costs that you'll have to take on as a result of that?
Yeah, the team will definitely grow in terms of our drug discovery. So creating new molecules and doing the preclinical work. I think that team is largely set. We might add one or two preclinical advisors. We've added a gentleman at Duke University, William Westall, who's one of the leaders in predictive animal models for neuropsychiatric disorders. So he's really helping us out with that, I guess, translational science. But the majority of funds will be used for clinical trials. So you design a drug, and then you go through that preclinical process, and you do what's called Ind Enabling Studies, which is effectively making sure that drug is safe to dose to humans, which can be quite an expensive process. Call it a couple, $2 or $3 million. And then you go to phase 1 clinical trials, which typically consist in the tens of patients. So let's say a 40-person phase 1 clinical trial. Some are 20, some are 50, and that's just to prove safety. And the real expensive stuff gets to be late-stage clinical trials. So phase 2 clinical trials, instead of tens of people, you're looking at hundreds of people, typically. And then in phase 3 clinical trials, depending on the indication, if you're looking at something like major depressive disorder, it can be in the thousands. If you're looking at something like cluster headache, due to its limited patient size, it will typically be in the hundreds. But nevertheless, that's where the bulk of the expense comes. So for us, we are already in conversations with pharmaceutical companies to potentially partner out our drugs for those more expensive later stage payments. So we view ourselves effectively as a discovery engine, creating new molecules and de-risking them to a point where a more deep-pocketed investor with perhaps less of a compelling pipeline in-house would look to partner with us and share the risk on that. And in terms of our team, we are certainly building out, and I think we're primarily building out by bringing in advisors for specific indications or areas of indication. For instance, binge eating is an important, we think is going to be an important indication. OCD is going to be probably an important indication for us. So we would look to bring in the thought leaders in that space to give input on what we're doing and make sure that we're going down the right path and talking to all the right people and designing our studies in the right way. So we will be expanding on that side.
So hypothetically, let's say everything goes well, the drugs that you're developing, they pass the safety clinical trials, which I'm sure they will, they pass the human clinical trials. At what would be like the earliest point at which they would become medically available to treat these conditions in like a larger population?
Yeah, so I would say best case 5 years.
Okay. Wow.
It's not a quick process, unfortunately.
It's not a quick process.
So if you're listening to this and suffering today, I wouldn't shy away from using psilocybin mushrooms or some of the other great drugs we have out there that may not be approved.
Well, I think this is the tricky part with the psychedelic space, like especially in the COVID-19 era, like mental health issues are skyrocketing. There are various other issues that are skyrocketing. And, because of the nature of the FDA approval process, it looks like MDMA at the earliest will be available by 2023, I think is what Rick from MAPS most recently said. Some of these other compounds, psilocybin, 2024, 2025. And at least from where I'm sitting, I go, well, look at what's going on with decrim. Like why do we, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this as someone who has done mushrooms and whatnot. Why do we need to spend millions and millions of dollars on doing this drug development process when we have medicines like ayahuasca and mushrooms and San Pedro and peyote, and even LSD, which is pretty accessible, which are already available? Why bother going through that whole process when we could just spend millions of dollars on lobbying or activism to get these decriminalized so that we can get them in the hands of people now? Like, what's your sort of thought process behind that in terms of making these substances available for healing?
I'd be fully on board with that. I think it's a difficult path, unfortunately, and I think it's one with risks. And I think that I'm fully supportive of the decrim movement, and would love to see liberalization in this space. I don't think that anybody should be told what they can and cannot put in their body. Certainly drugs like these, which would have, in my opinion, a quite profound impact on a lot of lives. Unfortunately, the FDA has a different view than I think you and I do. And they certainly have a higher burden of safety and efficacy, safety and efficacy than we do. So they're going to require a stringent process of categorizing these drugs, and I think what they're a point which they're probably going to focus on is the 5-HT2B receptor, the serotonin 2B receptor, which is responsible for increased cardiac risk. I think for most people, this is something that probably isn't that big of an issue, but the FDA certainly has had a history of putting black box labels and taking drugs off the market due to activity at that site. So, yeah, it's
tricky, isn't it? Yeah, that's where I go back to. It's tricky, man, because I get the whole necessity of the FDA approval process and all the money that's being spent and all that. And, a big part of me just goes, well, if we just taught people how to like have a cool little grow box that they just put some water on, and then they could have their own mushrooms, and then they could, develop a relationship there. Because I think, and this gets into the sort of another question that I want to ask you. I think a lot of what psychedelics represent is a shift in mental health care, where in the past it's been very prescriptive. You go to a doctor, he tells you what to do, or she tells you what to do. You take this pill at this point, you come back for the prescription. And what psychedelics do, from my perspective, is they essentially put you through a process where you come to realize what you actually need yourself. So instead of it being prescriptive, it's much more of a trial and error where you discover, well, what is it that I actually need to do to heal? And obviously there's a lot of trauma that needs to be worked through, through MDMA, and things that need to be clarified before we can get to that full healing process. But I think we give so much of our power. And anyway, long story short, I'm very optimistic about the shift that psychedelic medicine represents. And I think it's unfortunate that it'll just take 3 to 4 to 5 years until we actually get to that point. Because we know already, without needing all these safety trials and all these efficacy, right? We've had a lot of this since the 50s and 60s. We know these substances work. So a lot of this feels repetitive to some degree, and unnecessary. But
definitely. And I think it is for the most part. But you put yourself in a politician's shoes, and let's say you're a senator from a red state, or you're a congressman from Wyoming. It's very difficult politically to go out there and advocate for psychedelics without cover. And what clinical trials offer, and what the FDA approval process offers, is cover and allows for a reframing of psychedelics. So I think that the two movements are beneficial to each other, decrim and the FDA clinical pathway, and I think both will help the other. And as soon as we start seeing seeing vulnerable patient groups like PTSD victims with MDMA and mainstream media coverage of that, I think that will really help shift public opinion, especially in places like, let's say Wyoming, or pick your red state, and allow those politicians to have a more open view of what these drugs can do and their potential. So I'm very excited for the next, call it 15 years. I think I think that that the tide is certainly going that way, and to me, it's going to be virtually impossible to stop. The science is on our side. We know far more about these drugs and their mechanism of action than we did in the 1960s. In the 1960s, you didn't know what these drugs did. They had a preliminary understanding of serotonin receptors, but all they knew was there's a receptor and it binds. They couldn't classify those receptors into sub-receptor types. So there's 14 different serotonin receptor sites. The 2A receptor site is largely responsible for the serotonin, or for the psychedelic and I would say therapeutic action of the psychedelic drugs. And that was only classified in the 1990s. So I think that there's a much stronger footing to advocate for these drugs than there was in the past. We know that they're not addictive. We know that they work better than SSRIs for a lot of patients, and I think it's an inevitability that these drugs are going to be more widely available in the future.
So with that all said, like, where do you see this going in the next let's say not the next 5 years, because we've already talked about that, but like, where do you see the psychedelic space going in the next 10 years, the healthcare space, the drug development space? What's your sort of vision for whether it's specifically Bright Minds Biosciences or just the general movement of what's happening right now?
In the next 10 years, I believe I believe that doctors will have a number of psychedelic tools in their toolkit that they can offer. Those drugs will be slightly different for slightly different indications, and should be fairly widely available by prescription. In terms of the decrim movement, I'm not sure exactly when that happens, but I don't know. Let's say it could be 10, 15 years away. I don't know. Hopefully it's quicker than that, but
I think it's like 2 to 3 years. I mean, the BC, the Prime Minister of BC just called to decriminalize all drugs to Trudeau and the Canadian government. And I think with the whole defund the police movement that's going on in the Black Lives Matter, I think the first thing to go on the chopping block for police expenses will likely be the prosecution of psychedelics.
And I've done a detailed, our company's done a detailed examination of Canadian law as it relates to psychedelics. And quite frankly, you are not getting busted for growing, certainly for taking psilocybin mushrooms, or realistically for most other psychedelic drugs, but certainly for psychedelic mushrooms. The charges that are laid are typically involve much harder offenses, like there'll be a guy will be charged for possession of psilocybin with intent to distribute, but he'll also have heroin with him as part of the charge. There'll be a gun charge. I mean, they're not arresting you for the psychedelics. So for a psilocybin only offense, they're virtually non-existent in Canada. If you were to be a drug dealer, psilocybin mushrooms is probably a pretty good call. Unfortunately, with our health minister at the moment, Patty Hajdu, she has been a little less enthusiastic on the psychedelic movement as I would like. Hopefully that changes. I think an NDP government, who's in charge in BC, if they got elected, which I think is a long shot in the next election in Canada, would certainly accelerate things. But hopefully it happens quicker. And I think we really need, in Canada at least, we really need the TheraPsil initiative to go through, and that be the foot in the door to open it up to a broader set of indications.
I love it. Where are you from originally? Are you from the West Coast?
Vancouver originally.
You're from Vancouver originally. How long have you been in Toronto now?
I've been in Toronto for the last 6 years or so.
Good.
Yeah.
I love
hopping
Vancouver.
all over. How about yourself?
Oh man, I grew up in Michigan, in the Midwest. Left when I was 21. Lived abroad for 5 years, and then I've been in New York and the Bay, and now Miami. So a bit gypsied all over the place. Lived in Thailand, lived in Turkey, lived in Portugal, lived in Mexico.
Oh wow,
so I've hop, skip, and a jump.
that's a real nomad.
All across the globe.
Paul, I want to ask you a question. What is your what psychedelic are you most intrigued about? It could be an off the radar one. It could be a maybe something that.
That's a great question. You know, one that I found a few years ago, 4-ACO DMT, I've really enjoyed because it has the sort of mental clarity of LSD.
Yeah.
So it's quite easy to be creative, and there's still sort of an embodiment that comes from it, but it doesn't have the same sort of nausea or body load that you'll get with psilocybin mushrooms. So I find it to be a really good in between. And there's a lot of similarities between 4-ACO DMT and 2CB. So 2CB is another one that I've really enjoyed because 2CB lasts about, I would say 4 hours, whereas 4-ACO is maybe closer to 6 hours. But then the classics MDMA are phenomenal. I just had a San Pedro ceremony on Saturday that I'm still recovering from, which is why my energy isn't the greatest. So that was a full day, 12-hour experience in Miami, and then I've been sick with a temperature the last few days as my body has sort of been detoxing from that experience. So I'm not. Like I haven't got into all the 2Cs like 2CI, 2CE.
Yeah.
I haven't done like ALD 52 or like some of the more. But I've probably done 8 to 9 to 10 and find that the tryptamines I tend to enjoy the most.
Yeah.
And LSD is still my favorite, bar none. Of all the psychedelics.
It's tough to beat. The 2CI series is very interesting. And then again, that all came out of stuff that's basically what we're doing right now, which is like they use the chemical backbone of mescaline, San Pedro, and slightly altered it to create new compounds with new effects. And that's what I'm so excited about with Bright Minds is we have what I would say is an all-star team of medicinal chemists and a team that really understands the structural activity relationship between the body and all of these different compounds. A guy we're working with is a gentleman by the name of, sorry, I'm blanking here.
Okay.
John Mccorvey at University Medical College of Wisconsin. So he worked with, he was David Nichols' right-hand man for a number of years, and then was Brian Ross' right-hand man for a number of years. And I would say he's arguably the leading guy in terms of understanding how the how these drugs affect you in the body. And it's not a straight. There's a concept of bias signaling, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with. It's something where instead of hitting a receptor and it being an on-off switch, think of that as there's a subset of about, call it 10 different receptors, and you can create a slightly different experience by mildly altering the chemical structure and having that allow for a bias signaling response to what you're targeting. So it could be one of these bias signals could lead to more euphoria, for example. And we're really interested in addressing that and getting into that. I guess that would be kind of a third generation psychedelic, if you will. And one of the other interesting things is what we can do, what definitely not me, but the other guys in the team can do are tune these psychedelics to figure out the pharmacokinetics, which is basically how long the drug lasts. So creating drugs that are shorter in duration, or creating drugs that are longer in duration, would certainly have implications not only in the medical setting but also for psychonauts out there. So yeah, we're really pumped about just creating new compounds and getting more information out there, and doing it at an institutional level with big resources behind us, which is unfortunately something that Alexander Shulgin didn't have. And he didn't live in a time where he could do this. He was forced to do this in a room
in his backyard with friends.
Yeah.
Just bioassaying everything and testing it out, and
yeah.
So, and I think that's the beautiful opportunity that's happening with all the millions of dollars that's coming into the psychedelic space now. Is, I mean, it is a totally new frontier, and it's almost like, I think this was an Aldous Huxley quote, where it was, basically with psychedelics we can explore the inner antipodes of our mind. So we've obviously sort of, for the most part, explored everything there is to explore on planet Earth. Now, one could say, okay, we haven't been to the deep ocean and, like to the deep rainforest of Congo, but we've colonized and explored, and we know the whole sort of external landscape. And I feel like a lot of the work over the next 10 years, and it's been catalyzed by COVID, is to use these compounds, these psychedelic compounds, to explore, our inner worlds, and by better understanding our inner selves and exploring our inner worlds through psychedelic medicine, I feel like we'll be able to actually make sense of, the chaotic mess that we now seem to be descending into, to create what will be, a new culture, a new civilization, a new way of being, that's post-industrial. So I'm super excited to see what comes out of Bright Minds Biosciences, what comes out of the drug development processes, what these second generation psychedelics are. If you need any test subjects, just let me know, because I'd be happy to volunteer and participate. And it's very cutting edge, and it's very new. And I'm very, congratulations on everything that you've done so far. I know it's still super, super early stages, but it sounds like you have some phenomenal team members who are really at the cutting edge of what psychedelics could help us to understand about healing and the self, and, the mind, and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, certainly. And we're still discovering new chemical classes. Like, I think, going back to your earlier question, in the next 10 or 15 years, we will have, I think, completely novel psychedelics, not just versions of slightly different versions of known chemical compounds, but new chemical compound classes, which I'm very excited about. And I think if there are any psychonauts listening to this, they probably will be too.
Cool. Well, keep us updated on that. Let's open up, just because we have about 10 minutes left, I want to open up the floor a little bit if there are any questions that are coming through. So, we have 7 attendees. So Dennis, Graham, Ite, James, Mateus, Matthew Johnson, or Sergey, if you guys have any questions for us, if you could just drop them in the Q&A or in the chat box, and then I can get to those questions, and Ian can answer them for you. So we'll wait a minute or two for those questions to come in, and then see where it goes. Toronto's open back up, right? Like Canada didn't fuck shit up.
It has and it hasn't. I mean,
okay.
It's certainly more lockdown than it is open. You're wearing a mask everywhere. You have to wear a mask everywhere inside. I don't know anyone who's really going back to work fully in an office. But yeah, it's getting a little bit better. But in terms of Canada, I think it's probably the most lockdown part. How about Miami?
Yeah, total failure. I mean, they tried to open it back up and then did not go so well. And so now they've shut everything back down, and gyms are kind of open, but all restaurants, there's no indoor seating. You have to wear masks everywhere you go. So, which I mostly follow. I have my own thoughts on. Masks are good indoors, necessary indoors. You want to use them in closed spaces. I'm not convinced of the usefulness when it's sunny and bright outside.
Yeah.
Actually all that helpful. But anyway, it's all right. It still feels as if we're sort of on house arrest because we are basically on house arrest. So that's how it goes. Okay, first question. Thank you, Sergey. So the question is from Sergey. Why did you decide to go the VC route as opposed to an IPO, an ICO, or crowdfunding?
We have been completely internally funded to date, so we haven't taken outside money. We're currently doing our first outside capital raise at the moment. We have been talking with a number of VCs, family offices, high net worth, biotech investors. So yeah, I mean, we probably will do an IPO fairly soon. But yeah, that's more of a question of cost of capital.
So your plan is to go public. Your plan is to go public
eventually, for sure. Probably sooner than later.
Okay, cool. All right, next question comes from James. What do you think is the big inflection point that will make psychedelics acceptable in the pharmaceutical and mental health industries?
Great question. So I think we're already there. To answer it shortly, the pharmaceutical industry is quite risk averse, so they don't want to take on any like novel program like this internally. They're all basically waiting and sitting on the sidelines to pick their horse and figure out which psychedelic company or which psychedelic compound that they're going to bet on. So they're all there. They're all looking. We've had several approach us to date. So it's the interest is certainly there, and you're going to start seeing more pharmaceutical interest and probably partnerships in the near term here.
Beautiful. The next question is from Dennis. How long do you think it will take for the psychedelic market to open beyond ketamine? Do you foresee a partial opening for clinical purposes first? Let's maybe talk about Canada. Like, when does it look like things beyond ketamine will actually become clinically available for depression and PTSD and things like that?
So typically in drug development, you go for the FDA first, and all the other equivalent organizations around the world follow their lead. So Health Canada will effectively follow their lead. So you get an FDA approval, then you'll go to Health Canada, you'll go to the EU, you'll go to Japan, etc., and get it approved there. So it shouldn't take much longer. Maybe like a year after MAPS approves MDMA in the States, should be available in Canada. I don't know specifically what their plans are, but I would assume that's what they are. And then you have Compass right after that with, they're in phase 2 clinical trials right now. So as you said earlier, 2024 is probably the likely date. And then Usona is about 6 months behind them for major depressive disorder with the same compound. So that should be available, and that should be available basically at generic pricing for people in the United States in 2024, for people in Canada probably in 2025. And then some of these other compounds, the second generation compounds, the ones that we're creating, it'll probably be another 5 years at the earliest, I would say, before they're in the hands of patients through a prescription.
Beautiful. The next question is from Mateus, I want to say. He's interested in understanding the choice to IPO soon, so to go public soon, versus raising private money from VCs.
It's really a question of cost of capital and where your funding parties are coming from. So we've had interest from VCs. Right now, we think that there's a cheaper cost of capital in the public markets. There are a number of biotech investors we believe we can get for a larger capital raise as a public issuer relative to a private issuer.
Beautiful. Any other questions from the audience? Oh, one more actually. James Sower says, if you're doing an IPO, would that be a reverse takeover that you would do that through?
No, we wouldn't. So most listings in Canada are done by a reverse takeover, which is not really a thing anywhere else in the world, but it is in Canada. We will not be doing an RTO. We would be doing a direct list. So we wouldn't actually even be raising capital through an IPO. We would just be listing our shares. So yeah, it would be a more traditional route of going public.
Gotcha. Cool. All right, well, Ian, thanks for hanging out, dude. Taking the time, sitting down, chatting about Bright Minds. I feel like we got a little bit there, but there's a lot more that we could have gone into. So I'd love to like just let's stay in touch and keep me abreast of how things are developing. And yeah, I mean, I'm just fascinated with everything that you all are doing, and would love to just be in touch as things continue.
Great. I'll try to get some of our compounds whipped up, and maybe we can do the second one under the influence.
That's right. Yeah. I would love that. So, and if I ever come to Toronto, I'll hit you up, and same
Please
if you're
do.
up in the States. Let me know.
Please
I'm
do.
sure we'll cross paths at some point.
Thanks so much, and thanks
Absolutely.
everyone for listening. Thanks
Thanks,
Microdose
everyone.
for organizing.
Thanks for joining the Psychedelic Insider series, brought to you by Microdose and the Conscious Fund. Visit our website at www.microdose.buzz.